Good afternoon. Welcome to this third installment of the Bipartisan Policy Center's web series, Modernizing Congress. Previously, we've talked to the leadership of the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and then a group of scholars who look at interesting ways to measure Congress's productivity, information about its staff, about legislative effectiveness, and oversight. Today, we're joined by four Congress experts, scholars, who are contributors and editors to the book, Congress Overwhelmed. And the topic of that book is really an interesting one. It's not something we often think about when we talk about Congress. It's looking at congressional capacity. And so who we're joined by today, we have Kevin Kosar of the American Enterprise Institute, Tim Lapira, who's a professor at James Madison University, Chris Miller, who's a professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, and Laurel Harbridge Young, who's an associate professor at Northwestern University. Thank you all for joining us. Kevin, Tim, I'm just going to get started with you. Tell us, a little bit about why this book, and how is this topic of congressional capacity different from what we normally talk about when we're talking about Congress as an institution? Kevin, do you want to start us?
Sure, happy to. Am I coming through clearly? All righty. Well, thank you, BPC, for hosting this event, and for all of you in the audience out there. As you heard, all the folks on today's panel contributed a book to a book that we produced that came out about 6 months ago called Congress Overwhelmed. And I just want to spend a few minutes explaining what congressional capacity is and why it's a useful concept for thinking about what's working and not working on Capitol Hill and how to address those problems. So, Congress. Yeah. That little loved branch of government. The American public, it is true, has tended not to hold it in high regard, ever. There's pretty solid evidence that the public simply is not particularly enchanted with politicking, which we get a lot of on Capitol Hill, and all the horse trading and the collision of principles and prosaic demands for resources and benefits. And that's not to say anything of the fact that, the public tends to be turned off by the human peacockery and the outright buffoonery that is a feature of a national legislature. That said, the public has been really down on Congress for the past 20 years. And instead of, say, 40% of Americans thinking well of Congress, the approval rate has hovered somewhere between 10 and 20%. That's abysmal. Now, when you talk with people and ask them about what's wrong with Congress, they tend to want to answer in terms of what I call the 3 Ps: people, parties, and polarization. Those are the things to blame. So conversations about Congress's shortfalls tend to be characterized as, well, it's all Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell's fault. It's those people. Or, well, the Democrats are to blame. Or it's those Republicans who have gone nuts. It's the party's fault. Or finally, it gets characterized as, well, the problem is that the parties have become too extreme and can't work together. It's polarization. That's what's wrong with Congress. Now, for sure, there's truth in all these characterizations, and from them flow the demand. Fix Congress, what we need to do is to throw the bums out and put better people in, people who will choose, country over party, et cetera, et cetera. Well, interestingly enough, we've been trying that means of fixing Congress for a long time. Since the 1990s, we've thrown people out of Congress and thrown parties out of majorities an awful lot. Hardly anyone who's in Congress today was there 20 years ago, to say nothing of 30 years ago. And party control of the chambers has pinballed back and forth more rapidly than at any time since the late 19th century. Yet Congress is not becoming any more lovable. Why? Well, this is where our idea came in, that if you want to understand Congress's troubles, you need to look at the institution itself and its capacity. And thus we came up with this term, congressional capacity. Now, To understand what we're getting at with this term, it's useful to think about Congress in its broadest term. What is it? It's an organization of individuals established to achieve particular goals and to undertake certain activities. Like any organization, a business firm, a school, a music band, the performance of Congress is greatly affected by its capacity. That's almost tautological. It can only do as much as it's capable of doing. In the congressional context, just to put a finer point on it, we define capacity as the human and physical infrastructure Congress needs to resolve public problems through legislating, budgeting, holding hearings, and conducting oversight. That's congressional capacity. To illustrate it a little bit, examples of congressional capacity are its funding levels, its processes for executing tasks, like how do bills go to the floor and get passed into law, its technology for completing its work, how it internally organizes itself, its leadership, its structure, its people. So we've been looking at these factors for years now, and much of what we found is in the book Congress Overwhelmed. And we've been making an argument, at least I and a number of others, that Congress needs to direct some energy towards looking at its capacity, upgrading the institution itself so that it can meet the challenges of the day. And thankfully, our voices were heard, and we have seen some progress made. Those of you who checked in with the previous BPC events, you've heard from the Select Committee, you've heard about some of the things that are getting done. Reforms have been made starting 2014, 2015, first through the Ledge Branch Appropriations process, which is a vehicle for giving Congress more money and playing with some of its internal operations to make it operate a little more smoothly. And some of the reforms, as mentioned, have come through the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which was a kind of direct response to this cohort of people out here in civil society and also within the chambers saying, you got to do something to upgrade this place because it's in a time warp. That said, congressional capacity and the effort to address Congress's dearth of it, it's got a long way to go. Congress has not upgraded its capacity in a major way since the early 1970s. And the world has obviously changed a lot since then. The executive branch has grown enormously. There are about 180 executive agencies in existence, which is a lot for Congress to try to oversee, to say nothing of direct. They just struggle to even understand what's going on in the executive branch. Policymaking also has become way more complex with each passing decade. One example I like to use to illustrate this point is that when Congress first passed a bill to aid elementary and secondary schools in 1965, that landmark law, the ESEA, was 32 pages long. The No Child Left Behind Act, which was passed in 2003 and updated the ESEA, was 670 pages long. That's a lot to comprehend. And that's one issue area, one law. So there you have it, my brief introduction to this big topic of congressional capacity and congressional reform. And with that, let me turn over the microphone to my co-editor, Tim Lapiro.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting us today. Today I'm going to talk about really sort of three things related to the book, what motivated us to do the project, exactly what it is that we did, and then what we hope has come out of it, some of which already has, as Kevin has pointed out. So what motivated us? In my 2017 book, Revolving Door Lobbying with Trey Thomas at West Virginia University, we investigated the reasons why congressional staffers were seemingly increasingly inclined to become lobbyists. Of course, the answer is money, right? But that doesn't really explain why in the past 10 years or so, it has become so much more common than, say, the 90s, the 80s, or all the way back into the 1970s. So the option to leave Capitol Hill or leave the White House, leave the administration and make some money as a lobbyist was always there. But it wasn't as common in the past as it is today. So we identified two major factors. The first and foremost is, as Kevin already pointed out, one of the major factors of explaining Congress today is partisan polarization. It's an unavoidable observation of Congress. And it is, frankly, in the history of the entire Congress, it's frankly probably something that's more common than not. And so there's nothing really new here other than the observation that the entire policymaking apparatus relative to the 1970s or the 1980s is that it's been highly centralized to party leaders. And that is really what that means is most of the, not only the agenda decisions, but also the substance decisions about what goes into something like a 600-page Obamacare bill is being largely decided by fewer and fewer people in Congress. And the second factor we identified was the capacity to govern, or the government's internal capacity, as Kevin has pointed out, to learn about problems in the world, to develop and identify alternative solutions to those problems. And it was simply an observation that since Congress's peak in the 1970s of conducting hearings and writing new and groundbreaking legislation, Congress has generally declined in all of its activities, everything from oversight to legislating and investigations and so forth. At that same time, as Kevin has pointed out, the world has become so much more complex. It's not simply that the government has gotten bigger, but the world around us has simply become much more difficult for our society to manage. And at the same time, we've had less and less resources dedicated inside the government to identifying problems and trying to come up with alternative solutions. The takeaway there is that capacity has long been assumed, especially capacity in Congress, which is the most professionalized legislature in the world, has presumed to be constant. When in fact, what we try to point out is that the trend is that it has declined over time in its own terms, its own nominal terms, but also and especially relative to the executive. So we knew capacity was declining, but we only really had very thin evidence. At most, we simply had sort of head counts of staff who were employed on Capitol Hill in the service of supporting members in their legislative duties. What we've seen happen is not only a reduction in the number of committees and subcommittees, especially in the House of Representatives, but also a trend where senators and representatives have tended to hire fewer people in their Washington offices and more people back in their district and state offices. There has been almost a flip where the ratio was roughly 70% of staff in the 1970s worked in Washington, and now it's closer to 40% of staff work in Washington, whereas 60% are now working back in the district and state. So we knew there was a problem, but that evidence of simply counting heads was not really enough to get us to offer any good information and good ideas about what consequences this decline has had and what, if anything, we might want to collectively do about it. So what did we do? Kevin, Lee Drummond, and I sort of put our heads together, and we thought, well, let's do a really big project and trying to study Congress's internal capacity beyond simply payroll records. And so we cobbled together a team, including Alex Hertel-Fernandez and Alexander Furness, where we conducted a survey in 2017 that had two phases. First of all, we interviewed more than 60 senior staff in both chambers on Capitol Hill, in all types of offices, leadership committees, and member offices, and even in some administrative units like Legislative Counsel's Office, for instance. And then the second phase was to actually survey all Capitol Hill-based political appointee staff in both chambers. And the idea was to learn more accurately what their own background was and what their career paths and trajectories and expectations were, and essentially how close they felt to their work in Washington and on Capitol Hill. In addition to that, we asked simply some questions about their substantive knowledge in certain policy areas, their expertise on the many complex informal processes that really churn behind the scenes in Congress, and also how they use external information sources, what sources they tend to trust and not trust. And so the idea here was to really gather large-scale systematic evidence to point to what exactly the underlying apparatus of and especially human resources exist on Capitol Hill to help the members conduct the business on behalf of the American people. What we hoped to come of this was first simply on the academic side, we were hoping to kickstart a research agenda on legislative capacity, part of which comes out in the edited volume, Congress Overwhelmed. But also, I think we have succeeded in getting this on fellow political scientists and other social scientists' research agendas. And then, more importantly, on the practical side, as we are doing here, we wanted to provide a good common resource set of evidence and much needed systematic factual evidence that we could use to really deeply explore how common the congressional capacity problem, if there is one, which I think there is, and then also to help inform folks like the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, as well as advocates like the Bipartisan Policy Center on trying to develop a better solution so that in the coming years and coming decades, Congress can more adequately address the problems that the American people want it to.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Kevin. We'll turn now to a couple of our contributors. I might introduce this part of the program just by saying, what I find so compelling about the way you all summarize the book is this idea that generally people think you can solve the capacity problem with a just add water approach. If you just give members more staff, if you just increase their budgets, that will fix everything. And I think the research in the book bears out that there's a lot more to do than that. And so I'm really glad to turn over to Chris and Laurel, and let's talk about a few of those concepts. Chris, your chapter, your contribution, focused on what do staff know, and why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So this first part of the project, excuse me, was really trying to think about the part of congressional capacity that relies on staff. So when we think about the daily routines on the Hill, we know that staff are such a big part of it, but we often don't think enough about how they contribute to capacity. And so if we're searching to understand capacity and also understand how to improve capacity, it seems to reason that we want to understand more about what staff know. And just to say a little bit more about kind of the motivation for this slice of this broader capacity project, if staff are poorly informed, either procedurally or on policy issues, there's real detriment to the institution in the sense that poorly informed staff are much more likely to rely on shortcuts, to rely on information that comes from K Street or from the administration or from party leadership, and to not be in a position to evaluate that information, never mind produce its own information, right? And so it really hurts Congress, both as an institution and as a partner with our other political actors, if staff are not in a strong position in terms of their information. And so that potential for an information imbalance is really of concern for all of us on this panel, and those of you listening as well, right? This is something that we care about. And so that was kind of the motivation here. So for this chapter, I focused on staff knowledge, and both in terms of, as mentioned, procedure and policy, and it's based on the survey that Tim just explained. So I won't have to say anything more about it. But what I wanted to do is highlight a couple of the really cool findings we think from this survey, and just also to say how fun and important it was to have this survey, because really just counting heads is important, but doesn't get to everything, especially when we're talking about something like capacity. So first is just kind of a broad question of how much knowledge do staff have, right? And how much variation is there? And then I wanted to examine some conventional wisdoms or kind of preconceptions that we have about staff on the Hill. So first, just looking at levels of staff knowledge, this breaks down into procedural and policy, and it was always, specific. So House members were asked about House procedure, and Senate staff Senate procedure, and you can see here that there's quite a distribution. So the average respondent, the average staff member, got about 3 out of 4 questions right on procedure, and about 3 out of 5 questions on policy. And depending on how you see it, you might go, "Oh, that looks pretty good." Or you might be a little turned off by the low end of the tail there, right? Which is the suggesting that some staff members don't know quite as much as perhaps we assume that they do. So when we take those kind of stock proposals, like we'll just increase the number of staff, that's good, but let's also think about who the staff are, what they know, and how we can improve their knowledge and their capacity so that we get the most productivity, the most capacity for each staff member there. How can we improve? Even if you don't increase the numbers, what more can we do? Um, so with that kind of overall backdrop, I wanted to look at some of these variations. So one of the conventional wisdoms is, right, that the Senate is the upper chamber. And so the first thing was just to look at the 2 chambers and whether or not we find that Senate staff have more information. As you can see here, there's really no meaningful difference between the 2 chambers. So House staff and Senate staff look quite similar on both policy and procedure information. Um, Another big conventional wisdom that we have is that committee staff are more knowledgeable given their policy focus. And so here we look at knowledge scores by personal office, committee office, and party office. And what's really interesting is that when you look at those policy knowledge questions, committee staff don't look very different from the other types of staff members. When you look at procedural, the thing that really jumps out is staff members in party offices are strikingly more knowledgeable about the ins and outs of congressional procedure. And this is really interesting, and it's also very consistent with our knowledge and everybody's sense that parties are using procedure to advance party goals. And so it makes sense that party staff know the ins and outs in a way that others don't. So following up on this relationship between parties and procedure, this is looking at staff members' own partisanship across all offices. And we didn't find any differences between Democrats and Republicans per se, but what you find is that staff's own sense of partisanship. So staff who identify as weak partisans compared to strong partisans, when it comes to procedural knowledge, we see the same relationship. So staff that feel themselves like they're strong partisans know a lot more about congressional procedure. And so again, this matters if we think that it's going to affect the type of proposals, the type of legislation that's going to advance, right? We all believe that knowing the procedures helps you in the congressional setting, whether the House or the Senate. And so this variation across staff members could make a real substantive difference as well. Another area of exploration was specialization. So one way to think of this is experience and the longevity of people's careers, but also to think about what that day-to-day life looks like. And so here, now I'm just looking at policy knowledge, both in total and then, looking specifically at budget policy, healthcare, and national security, and looking at how frequently staff members reported working on these issues. And there's a really strong, clear pattern. The more you work on the issue, the more you understand it, right? Your knowledge goes up if you work on an issue daily as compared to working on it occasionally. And I think the real takeaway that I take from these data here are that specialization has rewards. So even if we have the same number of House members, but we divide the labor differently, House staff or Senate staff, and we divide the labor differently, we can perhaps get greater capacity out of the same staff by changing up the work that they're responsible for. Never mind if you add into the mix potentially expanding staff so that there can be even greater issue specialization, right? So having staff members working on 5, 6 issues, not surprisingly, you know less about those issues than if you're able to focus on just a few. And then the last conventional wisdom that I explored here is this notion of the staff brain drain. And so as Tim was talking about, he's done a lot of work looking at this kind of rotating door between Capitol Hill and other actors in Washington. And so here I just took a little slice of that, which is not whether or not they're leaving, but whether there's patterns in who anticipates leaving the Hill, right? So first we looked at their expected departure from Congress. So are those staff members who plan to leave Congress in the next 2 years noticeably different from those who plan to stick around longer? And we don't find really meaningful differences, some, but not huge here at all. And then in terms of their future career paths, so do staff members plan to stay in Congress? Do they plan to move to other parts of the government or to move to politically relevant private sector jobs, which would pretty much be K Street and lobbying jobs or similar, right? And again, what we find here is that there's not a clear, overwhelming pattern. Now, this doesn't at all say that we aren't losing potentially congressional staff members to other parts of Washington, but rather it suggests that the brightest, the best of the staffers are not systematically the ones trying to flee Capitol Hill. So if there's a bright spot in the brain drain story, it's that the temptations that lead congressional staffers off of the Hill are not necessarily enticing those that are most knowledgeable. And so that's really something that's important. It suggests that Congress is able to retain some of the most knowledgeable staff members, and that's something that can be built upon and capitalized on in other ways. So overall, one of the things, I guess, just to close out with is really to think about staff knowledge as a critical part of the institution's capacity to make policy, to interact with the other institutions, and really to balance that information. That's a critical part of overall capacity, is both the production of new policy and the ability to assess the suggestions and proposals that come from other actors. So in doing that, recognizing that there's a lot of variation in staff knowledge and how that can be improved, thinking about advantages of specialization, also of experience in retaining staff. And I think this pattern of partisan advantages and procedural knowledge is something that we would not have known about without this study and this survey. And I think that's an important thing to follow up on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And now Laurel Harbridge-Young will talk about an issue that really near and dear to our hearts here at BPC. She looked into congressional staff and what has become, I think, a pretty provocative concept on Capitol Hill, which is bipartisanship. Do you want to tell us what you found about that?
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So my chapter in this volume tackles the questions, actually two questions about the relationship between bipartisanship and congressional capacity. So the first question I tackled is kind of why is bipartisanship important for Congress to solve problems and govern? So kind of why should we make sure we think about the important role that bipartisanship plays there? And second, how are the institutional structures underlying congressional capacity, including staffer positions, experience, so forth, tied to the likelihood of bipartisanship in these policy negotiations? And so for this work, I drew on both a combination of empirical analyses that I'd done in other work with bills, co-sponsorship coalitions, and votes, and then also leveraging both of the things that Tim mentioned that the Congressional Capacity Group put together, the interviews of staffers, as well as the survey that Chris's work relied on as well. So to start then, I want to just briefly highlight some of the reasons that bipartisanship is important and really can be vital for Congress to solve problems and govern. And I think in many respects, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. But I just want to flag it from the empirical perspective of what does the evidence tell us here? And so first, bipartisanship is strongly related to legislative success. So even in the more polarized period of the last few decades, the bills that succeed tend to have bipartisan support. So things like the ACA or the Trump tax cuts, these are the exception, not the rule, in terms of bipartisan agreement versus partisan legislation. And so even though partisan legislation is common in the House and the Senate, and majority agenda setting can sometimes prioritize partisan conflict, when you look at the bills that become law, so the ultimate governing, the kind of capacity to actually get things done, this is where bipartisanship continues to be the norm in terms of the policymaking process. And this is noted as well in recent work by Jim Curry and Francis Lee, who find that the issues in which the majority party is successful tend to have bipartisan support in at least one chamber. And so at a kind of aggregate level for Congress, bipartisanship is important for passing legislation, developing a record of success. But bipartisanship also helps individual legislators develop a record of success. So kind of their ability to contribute to the capacity of Congress. So I have some ongoing work with Craig Voldman, Alan Wiseman, that shows that legislators' ability to bring in bipartisan co-sponsors on their bills increases their own legislative effectiveness in terms of moving their bills through the legislative process. And then lastly, kind of going beyond just the capacity to govern, I think that bipartisanship is also valuable for bringing in multiple viewpoints and the kind of perceived legitimacy of laws, which I think are some of these downstream consequences of thinking about congressional capacity. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about kind of the factors that might make bipartisanship more or less likely. So kind of transitioning then from my first question here to the second, as many of those in our audience here know, leaders, individual legislators, and congressional staff are going to be really important for whether or not bipartisan coalitions are built. And so, for instance, in the surveys that the Congressional Capacity Group put together, a Democratic House staffer explained that bipartisan conversations were what paved the way for the Toxic Substances Control Act of 2016. He talked about how there were hundreds of hours of meetings amongst staff, that they had put out discussion drafts when one side, wouldn't like something that was out there. They said they were really careful not to blow the whole thing up because they knew there was some common ground there and they had to work together to find it. And they talked about, it took 5 years to do it. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was something that staffers working in the background were able to do and kind of build relationships, build trust with each other. And so then the next thing I want to talk about briefly are what these findings from the Congressional Staff Survey suggested about which contexts, which conditions are more likely to foster bipartisanship among staff. So in the survey, we asked, when working to advance legislation, how often do you communicate with staffers from your own party? And then we asked the same question about staff from the opposing party. And so the findings are going to speak to kind of which roles, what conditions or characteristics are going to increase the likelihood of working with staff from the opposing party. So your willingness to work across the aisle. So perhaps not surprisingly, staff who are in more policy-focused roles work across the aisle much more than staffers in more PR-focused roles. Committee staff are significantly more likely to work across the aisle than staff in members' personal offices or the leadership. Senate staff are more likely to work with staff from across the aisle than House staffers. Staffers with longer tenures are more likely to work across the aisle. So again, speaking to kind of the benefits of keeping staff in Congress for longer. Female staffers are also more likely to work across the aisle than male staffers. So going back to kind of a large body of work from both psychology and political science about some of the gender differences in the kind of relational styles that people have. And then also staffers whose own ideological views are less extreme are more likely to work across the aisle. So it's just kind of an interesting parallel actually to the work that Chris mentioned that procedural knowledge was higher among the strong partisans there. Here, those with kind of less ideological views, which would likely be correlated with weaker partisans, are more willing to work with staff and more likely to work with staff from across the aisle. So these findings, I think, suggest that some of the recent trends in congressional staffing are potentially problematic for bipartisanship. So we have this buildup of leadership staff who are focused on messaging, and this may not be the best route for fostering bipartisanship. We have a decline in committee staff, and also a turnover in staff, which Tim alluded to in his work. So I'll go ahead and wrap up my comments there and hope we have time for your questions.
Thank you, Laurel. Why don't we start off with an audience question that came to us, and I'll pose this to the group because I think you all might have slightly different answers here. But from Stafford Ward, we ask, how can Congress better recruit people from other areas of the public sector or from the private sector to gain institutional, capacity in Congress rather than relying on the executive branch? Does anyone want to take a crack at that first?
I'll start, I suppose.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Go ahead.
Oh.
One thing I would suggest is, individual legislators need to be encouraged to look beyond their campaign staffs. That's a long habit in DC of people who helped you on the campaign. They're the ones you bring to Washington, D.C. They're the one you slot into positions. Perfectly understandable, but as a long-term trend, campaigning versus governing are different things. And, thinking about how those positions can be opened up to people with other skill sets, I think is important.
And I think
Chris?
there too, I would just add, thinking about places where there are, areas where a member wants to specialize or learn a lot about policy, thinking about, finding staffers or prospective staffers who are from those kind of industries or areas where they might be experts in that area. So not necessarily being, career political types of individuals, but thinking kind of outside the box in terms of what sorts of experiences or educational backgrounds or experiences could help there.
And if I may add to that, two ways potentially to think about doing that are fostering kind of partnerships or fellowships with professional organizations. I know there's some of that already occurs, right? But allowing for that type of training and bringing in somebody, then some of the potential salary differences might be split by those organizations and the Congress. But those types of programs can help bring, mid-stage career professionals into Congress at a point in time when they can really offer a lot of expertise. And at the other end, some of the efforts to diversify the intern pool and the early staff positions, to the extent that we get more people coming into Congress early on who maybe aren't the usual pathway to work on the Hill. Inevitably, different college majors, not, of course, I want all political scientists, to have a shot, but it'd be great to get other majors in there as well. And naturally, that will bring a broader perspective, even at that early and kind of entry level position.
And then I think I would add to that, pay them more. Staffers' wages have stagnated and frankly, in real terms, declined in the past 15 years. And that's partly tied to the fact that members of Congress are afraid to give themselves a raise because they fear electoral backlash, which is certainly understandable. But as Kevin started this program with pointing out simply that Congress is an organization like any other. So one way to recruit and to, more importantly, retain good staff, as Chris's work points to, and as Laurel's work points to, is that people with experience are going to do a better job on behalf of members whose aim is to serve their constituents. So one would be to pay them more. And I would say that in context that people don't go to work on Capitol Hill to make money, right? That there is a certain public service motivation that is common among staffers, that there are many ways in which Congress can really capitalize on that by providing opportunities for professional development and simply making staff feel as though they belong in their positions. I would say that the context today, I'm working on Capitol Hill, is one of which relies on complete loyalty to the member and to the party, and which is not very self-fulfilling. So one way to, I think, recruit and retain staff really would be to give them more important work, give them opportunities to advance their own knowledge and their own expertise, just like a Fortune 500 company would do to a middle-level manager by offering them opportunities for training and development. I think tax dollars would be well spent in doing that for congressional staff as well.
Great. And I just remind the audience, you can submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook, or you can also submit questions on Twitter using hashtag BPC Live. One question I have, Laurel, I think your research gets at, I think probably hard to identify concept, but the whole book really brings it forward. But, that I think people think of bipartisanship as rising and falling only with polarization or a lack of polarization. Your research clearly shows that, there are some other factors, at least at the staff level, about who engages in, bipartisanship. And so, I'm curious, tell us a little bit about the trends, that, if putting, your money where your mouth is, I think, where is the money going in Congress, and what kind of, behavior is that incentivizing?
So I guess a couple of thoughts there. So in terms of thinking about, what are some of the trends that kind of push towards bipartisanship or not? So certainly the competition for majority control is going to be something that is kind of decreasing the incentives for bipartisanship. The more you have divided government, especially if you have a divided, House and Senate, that has kind of your least incentives to kind of get things done, the most incentives to message. So I think certainly, unified government, I think, is actually a really good incentive for the majority party to find places where they do think that bipartisanship can be viable, to kind of work through pieces of legislation that are important to them, but that they recognize will need bipartisan support. So that's kind of at the aggregate level in terms of thinking about some of the incentive structures that face kind of the majority party in Congress as a whole. For individual legislators, I think that when we think about the factors that are pushing them towards bipartisanship or away, certainly, legislators who care more about policy substance and kind of the passage of policy, even if it takes kind of concessions and deals and working over time, that's going to be more likely to lead them to work across the aisle. Legislators who care more maybe about kind of making a name for themselves within the party, outside kind of media attention and others, it's going to be working against it. Legislators who are more concerned about primary elections and fearful of kind of how they view primary electorates are going to be less likely to compromise, engage in bipartisanship. And then I think at both the staffer and the legislator level, I think one of the things that came out in the interviews as well from the Congressional Opacity Group was that legislators and staff, I think, believe and recognize that they can gain a lot from opportunities to hear and talk with the other side in non kind of deadline based negotiations. And so there was a staffer in the interviews that talked about, these, groups where they would get together like 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, mix of members and staffers, and, talk about, policy substance and try to figure out like where are the things that they agree on what need changing. And, the comment talked about how, they were shocked that you couldn't even tell who was a Democrat and who was a Republican based on what their comments were. So I really think that one thing that I think needs more kind of institutional attention to is how to create these sorts of conversations, not just when it's based on, a deadline to get a COVID bill passed.
Thanks. We've got a question from Jim Whitehead, who says, what is the most important single step for congressional modernization? So what needs to happen in your view? I'm going to pitch this one to Tim first, maybe.
Okay. This is easy. I'll go back to my last answer. First, pay staff more, and not merely pay staff more. It's certainly earned and deserved, but the idea here is not simply to make work on Capitol Hill so lucrative that there are no other options, but rather it is to invest long term in our shared national legislature, and that the idea here is to make work on Capitol Hill a viable lifelong career option or a long-term career option. Right now, the average staffer works on the Hill for about 3.5 years. That's really no way to, and the average staffer is much younger than I am. She's in her 20s. And there needs to be some kind of incentive to give young people who have an innate public service motivation, an incentive to stay in the long term as they develop into their later adult years, where they're going to want to do things like we all do, like buy a home and maybe start a family, and do that while also contributing their knowledge and their expertise and their energy to making the Congress be the best and the best legislature that we can in the world. So I would say start there.
Great. Does anyone else want to take a crack at it? Kevin?
Sure. I would say that the most important reform is anything that enables and incentivizes legislators to behave like legislators. Their job is to make laws, oversee the public purse, and they need to be incentivized to do that work, which is hard, and it's often not glorious stuff. Going through the process of figuring out what's happening with a particular agency, trying to assess whether a particular program is effective. That's all very time consuming, to say nothing of if you actually want to change things. Give it more funding, give it less funding, legislate to change the program. Then you get into the business of having to negotiate. And my feeling is that there are a lot of members of Congress who basically don't feel like they have much power to do those things, nor do they have much incentive. And therefore, the power to make those decisions tends to flow either up the chamber or into one of the other branches.
Laurel or Chris?
I think they've made good suggestions. I would just be echoing probably here.
Yeah, that's okay. So I might just wrap up kind of with a combination of questions, one from the audience and one from myself, and I think they're related. But obviously, a lot of this, one, just the concept and the idea of working on Capitol Hill has become much more difficult in the wake of the January 6th attack. And I think that certainly we've seen from news reports has caused a lot of folks to leave Capitol Hill, reconsider their careers there. And there does seem to be a lot of frustration among staff in both parties, both about what happened that day and the response to it. And so, when we're talking about, for instance, a concept like bipartisanship, or how can staff help members to be more effective legislators more generally, I'm curious if you have ideas in that context around, after an event like January 6th, how do you, really support the staff and what are maybe the risks based on your research might be another way to look at it. Based on your research, what is the institution risk after January 6th potentially in losing? And this part from the audience, what suggestions do you have for using staff to build bipartisan bridges and increase lawmaking capacity? That comes from Scott Adler. So I think related, I maybe would just kind of add to that. We've also heard in a post-January 6th environment, some offices don't want their staff talking to staff from other parties. Is our staff, let's say for the ones who can they be bridge builders maybe where members aren't able to talk amongst themselves?
Oh,
Go ahead, Laurel.
I can start things off. So I think here there are a couple aspects that maybe are important to think about. So I think in general, based on the findings from the survey that I talked about in my remarks, certainly investing more in committee staff would be a way to kind of think about building up the capacity for staff to be bridge builders across the aisle, so more policy-focused staff there. But I do think in respect to your question about kind of where are we at after the attack in the Capitol from January, I think this is where it is a challenge that if the perspective that the party leaders and the parties as a whole are taking is this much more partisan confrontational approach, I think it is unfortunately going to be a lot harder for staff to be these bridge builders. That particularly, they're not going to be going against their, member in terms of how the member style is. Members obviously are going to also select staff who reflect their own kind of desire to work across the aisle versus, work with their own party. And so, I think we are at this kind of difficult moment where if the kind of partisan tensions surrounding what should have been kind of a unifying crisis for Congress instead kind of drives the parties apart and continues to, I think it is going to be difficult, even for staffers who want to work across the aisle, and it may lead to them leaving Congress at a higher rate than those staffers who are happy to kind of fight the partisan fight.
Chris, any implications sort of on the policy and specialization and procedure? And then we'll go to Kevin.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Laurel said, and I think, in some ways, staff members have more in common than they do different in their partisanship in a lot of ways, structurally, where they are in the institution, the challenges of being underpaid and overworked, the demands, and so forth. And so there is the real potential there for them to be a source of bipartisanship. Even in non-policy ways, right? Just to kind of show that personal connection. And I think more broadly for members as well, um, interview-based work has time and again shown that the basis for a lot of bipartisanship is simply knowing other people, right? Things that are not necessarily policy motivated, but it's, congressional sports or families knowing each other or social events. And it is harder to demonize somebody that you know in a personal way. And so that really matters at all levels, staff and member as well. Um, I think that, but as Laurel said, and as others have remarked, the leadership, party leadership, and the member themselves really set the tone, and we can't burden staff with another job, which is saving Congress from itself, right? We have to kind of think about institutional reforms that can help bolster that. So, are there ways that orientations, that training sessions can both serve a policy and knowledge kind of purpose, as well as maybe some of these personal bipartisanship connections that then could carry over, so that when your boss says, they're looking for some co-sponsors, somebody that's a lot easier to reach out to than cold calling. And so maybe there are some ways to do some of that. Similarly, losing staff after January 6th is a major concern. To be the silver lining optimist here for a moment anyway, it does give a chance to think about those new staff member orientations. How do we do this as an institution? Are there improvements that could be made, because we could be bringing in a larger than usual class of new staff members? So lessons learned that could be, put into practice relatively quickly, and maybe start to improve some of the things that we think could be improved for staff and for the congressional capacity overall.
Kevin?
Yeah, I'll be quick because I know we're pressing up against time here. Um, a legislator, a legislature is premised on the concept of you're taking a bunch of strangers, putting them in the same place, and telling them collaborate for the public good. That's hard, and it requires that people be there in person. And we know the congressional schedule and calendar often has people not here in person. We know that COVID has also made it difficult to get people together in the chamber. Those are immediate challenges. You also need members and staff to kind of have the space and the incentives to get together and to develop the relationships and develop the trust. Because without those things, it's extremely hard to legislate. And the result is people tend to just not try and kind of leave everything for leadership to decide.
Tim?
Yeah, I think I would sort of end on the idea that simply pointing out that to this day, nobody has yet been held accountable for January 6th. There was an insurrection against the joint session of Congress. We all watched it live on television. And while many people were probably observing the horrible spectacle of it all, like probably many folks in this on this panel right now, I was emailing and texting former students and friends and colleagues, literally worried about their safety. And I think it would go a long way to and send a loud and clear signal to staff and to members if members were to quite literally take steps to hold themselves accountable for the incidents that occurred, as well as their co-partisans, including the co-partisan and in the co-equal branch, who I think we can all agree had contributed to inciting that insurrection. So I think one way of moving forward is through a process of reflection and healing that we have not yet done, and that will be absolutely necessary. We can talk as much as we can about bipartisanship as an ideal, but that really can't happen until we reckon with the events as they occur.
Thanks, Tim. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're a little bit over time. I think the conversation was well worthwhile for it. We can't end this event, I think, without reflecting on the fact that this was a discussion. Capacity encompasses a lot of different things, but I think clearly from what we talked about here today, the congressional staff, the people who work on Capitol Hill, who make it run, are probably the biggest and maybe the most important part of congressional capacity. And in light of what happened on January 6th, I think I could speak for the whole panel and thanking everyone who works up there, who continues to do the hard work of their constituents and the country, what often, thankless jobs. We hear you and we see you. So thank you. And thanks to the panel. Go out, buy the book anywhere that good books are sold. It's an excellent read, and I think it'll help everyone understand a little bit better beyond just parties, politics, and people, as Kevin put it, what the dynamics are in Congress. Thank you all.